It is my pleasure, after a short break, to restart the conversation with the next panel. And it's my pleasure to introduce Nancy Marie Mithlo from the Fort Sill Chiricahua Apache as the chair of this panel. She is a professor of gender studies and American Indian studies at UCLA. And just to highlight, I was informed that her book, Visualizing Genocide, Indigenous Interventions in Art, Archives and Museum, was just published a few days ago. Okay, so applause. And just to remind everybody, the larger biographies are in your package. Please.
Hello, everyone. It's an honor to be here. I'm Nancy Marie Mithlo. My group is both in Oklahoma and New Mexico, and while I want to defer to our presenters, I'll just tell you briefly, mostly we're known by our imprisonment. So we surrendered in 1886, and we were told we would be removed for 2 years, and that was 28 years. So from Southern Arizona to Fort Marion, Florida, now known as Castillo de San Marco, to Mount Vernon Barracks in Alabama, to Fort Sill, which our name, our tribal name is after the place of our imprisonment, Fort Sill. My family is still there. I've heard many people ask questions about vibrancy, and of course we all kind of assert and then problematize the idea of resistance, but our group, every Columbus Day, Indigenous Peoples Day, that's our time to gather. And we're doing powerful, beautiful things out on the land. So I really want to be kind of a voice of testimony and hope to say that I'm a mom and I'm a grandmother, and we are blessed to continue. And I know that all of you kind of draw from that same fire, that source of strength. I see it in you and I hear it today. So I'm grateful to be part of the conversation. So it's my job to keep everyone on time. And I'm excited today to introduce Sisokaduta. He said I could just say Cisco. I'm terrible at pronunciations. So our guest today is Dakota from the Sisseton-Wahpeton Spirit Lake Peoples. He's enrolled at Lake Traverse Reservation, and he teaches the Dakota language at the University of Minnesota. Thank you and welcome, Cisco.
Wičháyuwašičupi. Was chante washte nape Uŋkíč'ihduzapi, Wičháyuwašičupi, the Dakota, bede hadakia Oyáte hechetahawahi. Nakon Sisseton-Wahpeton, bede wakantua Oyáte mataha. Nakon Sisseton-Wahpeton edmatumpi, mehunke ki Chokatakuwe, Chunku Gian Wičháyuwašičupi, mehunke ki Dakotapi, Hena Ija, bede hadakia Oyáte hechetahahipi, Uŋkíč'ihduzapi, Nakon Betukinde, Dakota Iápi, ki Iwowa hadakikte, Dakota Chaje Makupi, ki Sisokaduta Makiapi do. Hemiye. Nakon Tókhed Oyáte ki Wičhákasotapi, Nakon Oyáte ki Wičháyuwašičupi, ki Iwowa hadakikte, Nakon Tókhed Iápi ki Uŋkíč'ihduzapi. Hena Iwowa hadakikte. Chante taha Iwowa hadakikte. Tokahea Dakota iwaye. Nakon Iápi kinde Wičháyuwašičupi. Tunkashida wakantanka Iápi kinde Uŋkíč'ihduzapi. He Tokahea Iápi kinde Iwaikde Uŋkíč'ihduzapi. Nakun Makoche kinde Tongva Oyáte ta Wahihuni. Makoche kin Tawapi he Nina Piwada Yokpia Wahi. Nakun Ampetu kinde Tókhed Iápi kinde Ohana Wawaheda kikde. Hekta hana o Tókhed ta ia ishnana UK ka ia tuekchi ni chin he he nina teha awyukcha ka tuekchi nikte he maka he gache ka he taha ia ki we kapsun ka we etaha maka gashna ka nakun etaha mini he UK ka mini etaha ia we ki he machbiata iaye he on heche da oas wichoni oas he gache ka Minnesota makoche ta bedote ed wakantanka hechia mani ka nakun unchimaka wakantanka wayake ka wakantanka ki he nina yokshiche he wayake he unchimaka wakantanka iwacha dokcha yonik shicha he wakantanka he ayupte ichish tueda omakia ieshne he unchimaka he awyukchan ka he taha unchimaka wakantanka ekie wanade makoche kinde tate hiu ka mini ki hiu ka hechun unka Dakota gacha okishni he akihre dopa chun unka idopa he kiha he taha Oyáte ki Wičhágache bedote ed Oyáte ki Wičhágache he bedote hechia taha hipi unka he wakantanka Oyáte Uŋkíč'ihduzapi bedote he Minnesota makoche ed Wičháyuwašičupi makoche Uŋkíč'ihduzapi nakun Iápi kinde Uŋkíč'ihduzapi he Tókhed Iápi kinde Wawahedake wanade Wičháyuwašičupi ki Iwaikde. So first, I always try to introduce myself in Dakota and tell you everything I'm going to talk about in the Dakota language. And sometimes it's hard to go from one to the other because the Dakota language, in my opinion, is easier to tell these things in instead of English. English is the language of our oppressors, and sometimes it's hard to speak their language and talk about these things. But I'm going to talk here about the how they tried to wipe us out, is what I said in Dakota. So Wičhákasotapi is to exterminate people. And really, it meant to like wipe out animals or like a area of nature. And then it then became applied to us because that's what they tried to do to us. They tried to wipe us off the face of the earth. And also how they tried to turn us into Washichu people. Wičháyuwašičupi is to assimilate into a Washichu person. And that's our word for the Euro-American people, Washichu. And it has many meanings. One is that I heard, and all these things I've heard from our elders. This is knowledge gifted to me, and sometimes that's a hard thing too, because you know that you have to be the one to pass this on to the people coming after. And sometimes you feel like this is a very hard responsibility, and it's something you were entrusted with, so you have to keep going. But Washichu, sometimes people say it could be Wičháyuwašičupi, it would be Uŋkíč'ihduzapi as a bear, like it takes the bear paw, which is because they had these bear claw necklaces, fur traders. And then Wičháyuwašičupi would be, Washin is fat, and because they took all the good stuff for themselves. And then another meaning would be Wičháyuwašičupi. Wičháyuwašičupi is a spirit helper. And because when they came, they had like things we had never seen before. And so when they first arrived, we welcomed them to our lands. And, you know, we didn't think they were evil or anything. They were just other people that had come here to visit us. And in Dakota society, we have this taboo that you can't marry your own relatives. And so when new people come to our lands, we kind of said, well, this is good because there's new people to marry. So, I mean, it's kind of humorous, but in a way it's very true because, you know, you didn't want to marry your own relatives, so you had to travel very far to find other people to marry, because at that time, our elders, they kept very strict records of all the people that you were related to. And still, that's a practice today. They would always say, oh, you can't date that person, you're related to them. Anyways, so we welcomed them, and it was a good thing, you know, because they brought these new things, and they said, okay, we can use some of this stuff. And so it went like that for a long time. You know, we didn't really figure out, you know, their true intentions immediately, according to what I've heard from our elders. And you know, there was stories of things happening on the East Coast, and so then you know, our people took precautions. You know, there was treaty negotiations, and people said that we need to protect ourselves. So they kept trying to negotiate for the best possible outcome of these different treaties. And of course, they kept wanting more and more and more, you know. And it got to a point where they just kept pushing us onto smaller and smaller and smaller pieces of land, you know. And of course, they would take us to Washington, D.C., our leaders, and show them this is, you know, what you're up against. You know, militarily, they would take them to military parades, and this is the power of our government, you know. And so a lot of our elders, they didn't want to fight. They just wanted to make sure the next generation survived. And so they would in these treaty negotiations, they would always make sure they try to get the best deal possible. And, you know, a lot of our people question now, like, why did they always do that? But, you know, they were doing the best they could at that time. And so the Treaty of 1851 is an important treaty because they negotiated a strip of land along the Minnesota River. But when it got to Congress, they removed that portion of the treaty, and then it kind of set up the showdown because we were then at that point homeless in our homeland. And in my introduction, the creator in our oral tradition created us at the spot of the Minnesota and the Mississippi River conjoining. And so this is in our oral tradition where we were put by the creator. And so it was a hard pill to swallow, you know, and a lot of people talked about going to war. So at the discretion of the president, we were allowed to stay there for 5 years, and they signed another treaty in 1858, and they took away more land, and they kind of set aside all these payments for the land sale. But as the years went on, the payments were slow to arrive or didn't arrive at all. And of course, the United States was fighting the Civil War at that time. So in the summer of 1862, Dakota people were on the brink of starvation. And there was an incident where some young Dakota men attacked this farmer and wiped them out because they were hungry. And then also there was another incident where they went to this trading post and said, give us some food. And the trader said no. There was this famous quote, he said, let them eat grass. And that kind of set up this showdown, and the Dakota people then kind of decided that they had enough, and they declared war on the United States government at that point. And under the leadership of one of our famous Dakota leaders, Oyáte, Little Crow, they went to war. And the war didn't last very long. It was only about a month and a half long. And the Dakota people were not successful. They had some battle victories, but overall the war was lost. And one of the people who was leading the person leading the troops against us was Henry Sibley. And you know, he was married to a Dakota woman, and so he kind of was telling Dakota people just surrender, and only those people who were involved in the war would be punished. But when they surrendered, all the men who had participated in battle were convicted, and there was 303 were sentenced to be executed by military tribunal, and the rest of the people were rounded up, and it was about 1,700 men, women, and children, and they were forced marched to a place we call the Dakota concentration camp at ironically the spot where I told you in my introduction where they created us, where the creator put us, as Bedote, or what the Washichu call Fort Snelling, a present day site of the Minnesota Mississippi Rivers meet. And so one of our Dakota leaders who passed away, his name was Jim Anderson, he said, it's the site of our Genesis and genocide. It was a famous quote he said. And so it was a hard place to be still to this day because of what they did to us there. But the 303, they lowered that number to 39 under the orders of President Lincoln. And the day before the execution, one was pardoned, and so 38 Dakota men were executed on December 26, 1862. The remainder of the people who were imprisoned at Fort Snelling were then exiled to a place called Crow Creek, South Dakota. And that also is a place where a lot of people died. And from there, it was kind of the remaining people fled to North South Dakota, Canada, which is traditional Dakota territory anyways. There was a treaty signed with the British government, and so a lot of Dakota people fled to Canada to seek safety with the British. But after that, there was the reservation period, the boarding school period, which I know all of you are familiar with. And a lot of our Dakota elders, they had to go through these boarding schools, and that's where they were told not to speak their language. One of our famous Dakota elders, um, Sidney Bean from Flandreau, said that when he was in boarding school that he would there was this young man there, he was real tiny, and he would was speaking Dakota, and there was this big tall German guy. He would hit him and knock him down and said not to speak our language, and he kept getting back up and he said, you keep hitting me because you're not going to take my language away. And I remember he said that that inspired him to keep speaking his language. One of my uncles said that when he was in at the Holy Rosary boarding school on Pine Ridge Reservation, that whenever they got caught speaking their language, they would use a barber, the strap they used to sharpen the razors, to whip them. And but he never stopped speaking his language. And thanks to elders like that who kept our language alive even through the dark ages of these boarding schools, that we still have a language today. And so I view these people as our heroes, and I'm eternally grateful to them. My own grandparents, my mother's maternal grandparents, they were both fluent language speakers. And when I started learning my language in 2000, I went back to share what I was learning with them. And I remember my grandmother said, we don't speak that language anymore. We speak English now. And it was very painful to hear that. But I was talking to my mother about that, and she said it's because of what she had to endure at the boarding schools that she says that. And the stories they said was she was at a boarding school in Rapid City, which became Sioux Sands. And whenever she would speak her language, they would lock her in a closet and keep her there. And she had to use the bathroom there and eat her food there. And when she got off the train to go back home, she ran to give her grandfather a hug, and they started talking to each other, and she realized she couldn't understand him anymore because he was speaking Dakota and she was speaking English. And she made a vow to relearn her language. And I do remember her talking to her sister one time, and they were speaking Dakota to each other, so that made me happy. But I made a vow at that point to learn this language and be one of the people to pass it on to the next generation. And one of the things we just started this year, after consulting with a lot of other Indigenous people who are doing the same thing, is we just started a Dakota language nest in Minneapolis at the University of Minnesota campus. And I don't know if they probably saw me with my wife and my son. He's 4 years old, and he's in there now, and he's learning the language. And that's the only language I speak to him, is Dakota. So my hope is he'll grow up bilingual. I wish there was a place where we could go and that was the only language we would be speaking, but unfortunately we're surrounded constantly by the English language. But a lot of things are being done to help repair the damage done by the boarding schools, the assimilation policies, the policies of extermination and genocide. As I mentioned, we have the Dakota language nest right now. We also recently started a couple of years ago this project called the Dakota Audio Journal at the University of Minnesota campus, where we record fluent speakers and we create a online journal where people can go and listen to fluent speech uninterrupted by English. And our hope is to create this archive of language, so future generations can listen to natural speech of our ancestors or elders. And we recently started in September our Dakota language major, and it took many years to get it, but our hope is to create eventually a master's and doctorate program all in the Dakota language at the University of Minnesota campus, which, you know, has been a tough battling them because they always say, oh, we're on Dakota land. Well, then do something about it. You know, they have these land acknowledgements, and I'm kind of sick of the land acknowledgements. I think Indigenous peoples, it's good for us to do land acknowledgements to each other, but when these institutions do land acknowledgements, they need to put something behind it, you know, other than just a bunch of words. So there's stuff being done to kind of reverse the trend of language loss and, you know, genocide, and our people are leading the way. And that's what makes me happy, is that we're doing the work, and we're not relying on the Washichu people to save us. And I think that's the way it should be. So I think my time is up, and I'll turn it over to my fellow presenters.
Maybe 5 minutes for questions. We started a little late, so if there's any questions,
I thought I was done.
Hi, appreciate everything that you said. With these land acknowledgements, I'm curious, like, ideally what you'd like to see done. Like, you know, if you were president, what would you do?
President of... you know, I don't think I'd ever be president. You know, in fact, I've never said the Pledge of Allegiance or sang the national anthem. You know, I think return all the stolen land, and at these institutions, they could have free tuition for our people, and put some money behind teacher training, developing the programs and infrastructure, and letting our people make the decisions for what needs to be done instead of non-Indigenous peoples. And you know, it takes a long time to develop these things, so they need to have patience too, to let our people learn the skills so that we can lead the way. Yeah.
You mentioned an archive of the language. Can you let us know a little bit more of what that idea is about?
Yeah. So it would be an audio archive, and we partnered with a tribal college on my home reservation. And the reason we did that is because a lot of times these like tier 1 institutions like University of Minnesota, you know, kind of seems like a ivory tower, and we go into these different places and tell them what to do. So we wanted to partner with the tribal college to kind of get closer to the community and show that we can have a partnership with people kind of more on the ground. And so they're kind of doing most of the work in that area. They have recording sessions with fluent speaking elders, and then there will be a written transcript of the recording, and then a translation to English. But our hope is that the audio archive would allow people to listen to natural fluent speech, because in 15 to 20 years, there won't be any fluent speaking elders left. And I was recently visiting people in Hawaii, and that's what they told us there, is that all their first speakers, that generation kind of left, but they created a new generation of speakers. Yeah, and that's what really needs to be done, is we need to start creating a new generation of fluent speakers. But in the meantime, we have to preserve what it sounds like, so that we can go and listen to that, because English has a different accent than Dakota, and we have to make sure we don't lose that. Okay. Yeah, thank you.